distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to day 2 of the 21st edition of the World Sustainable Development Summit. This is the first plenary session for the day and will be on leadership in developing countries, reconciling opportunities and challenges for a climate resilient development. This session will be moderated by Dr. Pradipta Ghosh, Distinguished Fellow TERI. We are very delighted to have a distinguished lineup of speakers today. First, we have 3 ministerial addresses by Her Excellency Dr. Yasmine Fouad, Hon'ble Minister, Ministry of Environment, Egypt, Her Excellency Ms. Khadija Naseem, Honorable Minister of State for Environment, Climate Change and Technology, Maldives, and Her Excellency Ms. Mariam Almheiri, Honorable Minister, Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, UAE. This will be followed by 3 special addresses by Mr. Seydou Bari Sidibe, Advisor to the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development, Guinea, Dr. Junaid Kamal Ahmad, India Country Director, World Bank, and Mr. Kamal Kishore, Member Secretary, National Disaster Management Authority. I now invite Dr. Pradipta Ghosh to conduct the proceedings of the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nivedita. I have great pleasure in welcoming our distinguished speakers to this ministerial session on leadership in developing countries, reconciling opportunities and challenges of climate resilient development. For once, we have balanced gender representation from women in the ministerial, among the ministerial speakers, and this is where leadership on the environment resides. The past year, the world has witnessed some apocalyptic events of climate disasters. We had the unprecedented wildfires in California. We had floods which were more extensive and created more damage than in any recorded history in Germany, as well as in China and in India. And of course, there were several other extreme weather events all over the globe. However, in the past couple of months, several other events have drawn our attention to the nature of the challenges that have to be overcome as we move to a climate resilient planet. First, fossil fuel prices, that is coal, oil, natural gas, have skyrocketed, impacting economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and causing distress to the poor. This is attributed to a mismatch between the scaling down of fossil fuel investments and the scaling up of clean energy investments, leaving an energy gap which the market has resolved to higher prices. Second, in our immediate neighborhood in Sri Lanka, a planned rapid move to natural farming has resulted in major shortfalls in food output, depressed farmers' incomes, and adversely impacted the fiscal situation as the government has sought to compensate the farmers. Third, in a recently released study by the well-known consulting firm McKinsey, relying on a well-known global climate-linked economic model, the incremental investment costs globally of net zero have been estimated at more than 250 trillion US dollars, which is more than 4 times the current global GDP. This level of incremental investment will certainly impact economic growth in developing countries, besides reducing both fiscal allocations and private investment in social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, public health, water supply, sanitation, and so on, and thereby render the task of poverty eradication much more difficult. Clearly, the reconciliation of development needs and climate resilience is a huge policy challenge for all developing countries and calls for enlightened leadership of a very high order. Which finally comprises ministers who are closely concerned with such difficult policy challenges. Their countries represent a microcosm of all developing countries, from a small island developing state which faces the existential threat of sea level rise, the Maldives, to a country whose millennia-old civilization has been critically dependent on a single major freshwater resource, which may be threatened by climate change, the Nile, that is Egypt, to a country whose economy has been largely dependent on exports of oil, which will be adversely impacted by GHG mitigation worldwide and must accordingly rapidly diversify its economy, that is the UAE. We are also privileged to have with us three other distinguished speakers, one from the Republic of Guinea, which is a significant oil exporter and also faces the prospect of a fall in exports on account of global decarbonization, and which is of poverty eradication, which is common to many developing countries. The World Bank, which has embarked on major initiatives to assist developing countries with both decarbonization and adaptation, and from India's National Disaster Management Authority, which in less than 2 decades of existence has demonstrated great capabilities both in anticipating challenges of climate-related disasters and organizing relief and rehabilitation. With these remarks, I invite our first speaker, Her Excellency Dr. Yasmine Fouad, Honorable Minister in the Ministry of Environment, Egypt. Dr. Yasmine Fouad was appointed Minister of Environment of the Arab Republic of Egypt in June 2018. She was previously Assistant Minister of Environment since 2014. She has more than 20 years of experience in environment and cooperation organizations, NGOs, and universities. So, Dr. Yasmine Fouad, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be participating in the panel today at the road to COP27, where the world is really facing the adverse impact of climate change, especially the price that should be paid by developing countries. Developing countries face various challenges due to the increase of the vulnerability to climate change impact, with reduced adaptive capacity to allow communities to be more resilient to such impacts. Accessibility to the means of implementation, especially climate finance from public sources, is a cornerstone in facing those challenges. Developing countries would like to access the new additional finance that is adequate to meet their needs, and the right to have the appropriate technology for both mitigation and adaptation to climate change, also to enhance the national capacities to be able to fulfill the requirements of the UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement. As Egypt is the COP27 president and the ongoing to the road to COP27, Egypt will build on what has been successfully achieved in Glasgow, continue the political momentum to achieve a balanced progress in all negotiation tracks, completing the remaining works and the mandate on different agenda, as well as ensuring inclusivity and openness to all parties and observers. Egypt considers that phase as an implementation phase. We have almost finished the Paris rule, and we should now focus on how to implement it and accelerate accessing to the means of implementation. As resilience is the topic for this session, we have the work program of Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation. It is indeed a key step on the right track to support adaptation, but also it will depend on the next steps for implementation. The work program is set to enable the full and sustained implementation of the Paris Agreement towards achieving the global goal on adaptation with view to enhance adaptation, both action and support. The work program will touch upon the methodologies, the indicators, the data, and the matrices, the needs and the support needed for assessing progress towards the global goal on adaptation. And the work program is going to feed in the global stock in a matter of contributing to reviewing the overall progress made in achieving the global goal on adaptation. As for the long-term finance and the new collective goal on climate finance, there was an encouraging movement in Glasgow on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. And the momentum has to be maintained along the remaining work, including the establishment of the ad hoc working group and the high-level ministerial dialogues from 2022 till 2024. Climate finance should represent a progression beyond previous efforts and be scaled up with concrete steps to meet the new collective quantified goal from the floor of the 100 billion per year, taking into account, which is very important, the needs and the priorities of the developing countries. It's very important that also the case studies that could be further replicated and upscaled would be brought up to the road to COP27 in order to identify how these needs, what are the best practices. But we need also to understand where are the lessons learned. There's no time really for a trial and error, for having more actions towards resilient communities. In Egypt, as a case study, we have been progressing significantly over the last few years on the national climate action. The first thing that is very important is to institutionalize the process at the highest level, at the political level. So we moved our National Council from climate change being anchored only at the level of the Ministry of Environment to be anchored at the level of the cabinet. So we have the Prime Minister heading the National Climate Change Council. This really had made a huge difference at the national level. We cannot say we want to mainstream climate change in the development processes, actions and programs at the national level while we're not putting the head of the government at the heart of that part. Once we've done that, things had been moving very rapidly and progressively. We were able to go ahead with identifying our needs and our priorities. We've put that in a national climate change strategy up till 2050 with the pillars of mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, but much more important, governance. And that's why I'm saying the climate governance is really very important to set the road at the national level. But this is not only the way, this was just a start. We were very bold within the pandemic to identify what we called environmental sustainability criteria in our national budget. We started by ourselves before preaching the private sector or the banking sector. We have put very strict measures for greening our national budget. We will reach 50% of the government funded projects to be green projects by 2024 and 100% of the government national projects to be green projects by 2030, aligning to our national strategy for sustainable development. But we moved further into allowing more private sector investment when we announced the first green bonds in North Africa and Middle East with 750 million USD. And when we focused on the projects, we focused on the projects that would keep the balance between mitigation and adaptation, the transport projects and the treated wastewater. It's also important within the package of discussing resilience and adaptation at the national and at the regional level, not only to identify the global goal and discuss with the negotiators the part related to the global goal, the data, the matrices that I've mentioned before. But it's important to move from having strategies on adaptation to action plans. And how can we make more investment and bankable projects in adaptation? Because that's a key challenge actually for the developing countries. Regardless of all the success stories that we have at the local communities, how can we have large scale adaptation projects at the investment level and be bankable one. I wish you all the best. I try to abide with the 10 minutes that is being allowed, but giving a quick snapshot on the road to COP27 with where are the challenges and Egypt case study. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And indeed, we look forward to Egypt's presidency and leadership in COP27 to carry forward the Sharm el-Sheikh work program. And you have very rightly identified the key challenges in the work program. And we certainly look forward to a successful completion of the work program at COP27. And you have also very rightly highlighted Egypt's own national programs, and particularly the targets for greening of the national projects in the Egypt under the Egyptian public finance. And certainly this is an example to many developing countries around the world. So thank you very much for your address. So our next ministerial speaker is Her Excellency Ms. Khadija Naseem. She is Minister of State for Environment, Climate Change and Technology, Republic of the Maldives. Earlier, she was Environment and Climate Change Specialist at the same ministry. So over to you, Madam Khadija Naseem.
Thank you and good afternoon. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to begin by conveying our minister's sincere apologies for not being able to join the event today due to an unexpected emergency. On behalf of her, let me begin by extending my heartfelt gratitude to the organizers of this forum for inviting the Maldives to contribute in this important dialogue. Maldives is one of the lowest lying countries in the world. 80% of our islands are just a meter above sea level, making us extremely vulnerable to rising sea levels. Already, 90% of our islands report flooding, and 97% report shoreline erosion, and 64% report severe erosion. And nearly 50% of all our housing infrastructures are just within 100 meters from the coastline. Only a few of these can withstand tidal floods, let alone a bigger event like the tsunami. As a result, some of these extreme events has caused relocation of entire populations in some of our islands, negatively impacting the socio-economic well-being of our communities. Hence, climate change is our biggest existential threat with far-reaching consequences. Excellencies, the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has further underlined the urgency of taking global action to address climate change and deal with its adverse impacts. It further elaborates that without urgent and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, it will be impossible to limit the global temperature goal at 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees Celsius. By 2050, it is expected that up to 90% of our coral reefs will die due to climate change. And for survival, the global temperature has to be kept at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Our economy thrives on our environment and resources. Fisheries and tourism are the backbone of our economy, and our beautiful beaches, our coral reefs, and our underwater ecosystems are the key tourism product. Agriculture also plays a critical part in the livelihoods of our people. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated our economy's exposure to external shocks, and these threats are further weakening our capacity and ability to build resilience and achieve sustainable development. Maldives is notably one of the hardest hit countries in the world by this crisis in terms of its impact on the GDP. Therefore, this pandemic has been a stark reminder of our vulnerabilities and provided us with an immense opportunity to improve and reimagine our public policy and development planning to ensure that we build back better for both our planet and our people. To date, the Maldives have protected 13% of our coral reefs, and we are committed to protecting 20% of our oceans by 2030. We are also phasing out single-use plastics by 2023, and currently we have 73 protected areas, and we are home to 3 UNESCO biosphere reserves. We also have pledged to be net zero by 2030, provided we get the immense support required by our development partners. So the Maldives are taking very bold steps. We also firmly believe that implementation of climate action can only be achieved by the provision of adequate, predictable, and sustainable financing from developed countries to developing countries, and especially for those SIDS. For the large part, it is recognized there has been a heavy focus of financing for mitigation aspects in developing countries. Mitigation is very important and a significant pillar in addressing climate change. However, Maldives and other SIDS have constantly been calling for the fulfillment of obligations under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and we seek a balance in both mitigation and adaptation financing. We're also actively advocating for grant-based finance for adaptation-related measures. Addressing climate change also requires building and retention of human resources and institutional capacity. Hence, Maldives is advocating for building local capacity in those areas as well. Climate change cannot be limited to nations. Its impacts extend beyond borders, beyond human exigencies that are minor in the face of what the planet asks us of today. And therefore, our response to this challenge must look beyond borders. We need to maintain the spirit of multilateral cooperation that characterized the Paris Agreement, especially as a lesson learned from the current pandemic. In this regard, I'm indeed pleased to note our minister's leadership role at COP26 this last year, facilitating the ministerial consultations on the global goal and adaptation, which led to the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the GGA. I think this is a significant step towards establishing the global goal and adaptation outlined in the Paris Agreement. And for us, it is extremely vital to ensure that the GGA reflects our realities on the ground and addresses our most pressing adaptation needs. We have a long way to go, but I think this is a great starting point, and we really look forward to the COP27 in Egypt, where by the time we would have already had technical discussions towards the GGA goal. Excellencies, on a concluding note, I would like to reiterate calls upon our development partners to take practical steps to support us in the creation of much needed fiscal space to address climate change. I call upon the international community to step up in their efforts to raise ambition in climate finance. This is a matter of urgency for us. Let me once again convey my gratitude to the organizers for convening this dialogue, and I look forward to the discussions that follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your address. And indeed, Maldives has been long recognized as being a small island developing state which is particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, in particular sea level rise. And Maldives has for a very long time played a stellar role in highlighting the vulnerabilities of small island developing states, as well as the needs of adaptation, means of implementation to be focused on adaptation in the climate change negotiations. And we certainly look forward to Maldives' continued involvement and indeed playing a strong advocacy role in COP27 while the Sheikh is being addressed and negotiated. So thank you very much indeed for your address. Our next ministerial speaker is Her Excellency Ms. Mariam bint Mohammed Saeed Hareb Almheiri. She has been appointed as the Minister of Climate Change and Environment of the United Arab Emirates. Prior to her current role, Her Excellency Mariam Almheiri was Minister of State for Food and Water Security.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to address you today, and I thank the Energy and Resources Institute for organizing this important event that addresses key challenges on our path to a resilient, equitable world. As extreme weather events are becoming more intense and frequent than ever, impacting the lives and livelihoods of millions of people across regions, climate change adaptation is the need of the hour. Science-based adaptation action should be at the center of our collective response to climate change, particularly to protect those in vulnerable developing countries. The urgent call to ramp up adaptation action has been outlined by the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh Work Programme, urging countries to establish robust systems for monitoring and evaluating adaptation actions specifically designed to address local challenges. As a climate-vulnerable country, the UAE is taking concrete measures to climate-proof its key sectors as part of its National Climate Change Adaptation Programme. We are also committed to helping other countries reduce their emissions and increase their climate resilience. We have allocated $1 billion in aid and concessional loans for renewable ventures in over 50 partner countries, especially small island developing states and least developed countries. We are also supporting island countries in building hurricane-resistant power infrastructure as part of our clean energy initiatives. Ladies and gentlemen, to help vulnerable communities become climate resilient, increasing climate finance is instrumental, with adaptation efforts taking up a bigger share than today. In 2020, $1.6 billion were spent on mitigation projects, while only $586 million were spent on adaptation projects. These figures highlight the fact that we are far from balancing climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts. Distinguished guests, the Paris Agreement calls for all countries to achieve climate neutrality by mid-century. To win the race to net zero, governments must come up with the policies and incentives to accelerate their national decarbonization efforts and bring all sectors on board. Last year, we launched the UAE Net Zero by 2050 strategic initiative as a valuable opportunity to drive our economic diversification strategy to create new industries, technologies, skills, and jobs while protecting the environment. We're working closely with all sectors to adopt innovative decarbonization technologies, develop environmental goods and services, and channel investments towards climate resilient and sustainable projects. We are also collaborating with our global partners to share experience and best practices, because global challenges can only be addressed when we work together. The progress made so far proves the strength of collective action. The world needs to continue to push past its limits and raise climate commitments to safeguard people and the planet. Year after year, COPs have offered opportunities to build on achievements and register renewed commitments across regions. However, it is important that we continue to work throughout the year, not just around the time of the conferences. Following on the success of COP26, COP27 will bring countries together to re-engage on important issues, such as raising climate ambitions up to 2030 and beyond, adaptation and finance, which is critical for just and inclusive action. As the host of COP28, the UAE is committed to working closely with COP presidencies to ensure climate action is progressing at the right pace. We intend to deliver an inclusive, consultative, and accessible event. In this critical decade for climate, we believe there is an enormous potential to build a better world for all through multilateralism. At COP28, we seek to rally all actors to address this defining challenge of our era and work together to boost investments and meaningful action for climate. We will focus on the global stocktake, measuring how far we have come and what still needs to be done to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. We are following the enhanced transparency framework as a key mechanism to ensure countries are working to meet their nationally determined contributions and moving towards climate neutrality. We look forward to collaborating with everyone and hope to see you at COP27 in November and to host you at COP28 next year in the UAE. There is no time to waste. Our future generations will hold us accountable for the actions we take today. Let's give them the future they deserve and demand. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your address. And indeed, we look forward to the continuation of the leadership which Egypt will provide at COP27 to the leadership which will be provided by the UAE in COP28. And we also thank you very much for giving us an overview of UAE's own actions and initiatives on climate change, in particular on adaptation. Of course, mitigation has certainly not been neglected, and also about the UAE's commitment to provide resources and means of implementation to other developing countries. So I will now invite our next speaker. It's a special address from Mr. Seydou Badi Sidibé, Advisor to the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of the Republic of Guinea. He's a specialist in legislation, research, and analysis of legal and institutional changes. So, Mr. Sidibé, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Et mesdames et messieurs les représentants du gouvernement, distingués participants, mesdames et messieurs, en vos rangs, fonctions et statuts, tout protocole confondu, je voudrais, au nom du peuple guinéen, du gouvernement et de son Excellence, Monsieur le Président de la République de Guinée, remercier le gouvernement de la République fédérale de l'Inde pour cette invitation qui me donne encore l'occasion pour exprimer l'engagement de mon pays, la Guinée, dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques et dans l'atteinte des objectifs pour le développement durable. Cette session, placée sous le thème « Vers une planète résiliente, assurer un avenir durable et équitable », intervient dans un contexte de grands enjeux climatiques, économiques et sociaux, exacerbés par la pandémie de la COVID-19. Nous saluons hautement cette initiative de sommet virtuel qui nous réunit aujourd'hui pour rechercher des voies et moyens afin de bâtir un monde résilient et harmonieux. Vous me permettrez de ne pas vous faire ici un récital de problèmes environnementaux qui sont connus de tous. Je choisis plutôt de partager avec vous la politique environnementale de l'État guinéen pour une gouvernance plus inclusive, plus rationnelle, plus équitable du capital naturel. En effet, la Guinée est un pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest qui jouit d'immenses ressources naturelles qui lui valent des surnoms de scandales géologiques et de châteaux d'eau de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Mais elle n'en demeure pas moins concernée par les problèmes environnementaux. C'est pourquoi la République de Guinée intègre en première ligne dans son plan national de développement économique et social la gestion durable de l'environnement comme une priorité. Convaincu que la solution pour la préservation de l'environnement passe par l'adoption d'une attitude nouvelle, la Guinée se conjugue dans un élan de changement de mentalité et se veut un acteur dans la résilience face au changement climatique. Je me souviens encore de cet engagement riche en humanité et du Mohadas. Je disais que je me souviens encore de cet enseignement riche en humanité du Mohadas. Du Mohadas Karamchand Gandhi qui disait, le Bapuji qui disait, en parlant du caractère abusif de l'homme envers la nature, disait, je cite, dans ce monde, il y a assez pour les besoins de tout le monde, mais il n'y en a pas assez pour l'ego de tout le monde. Mesdames et messieurs, permettez-moi de rappeler que les défis de notre être sont exigeants et requièrent de nos différents gouvernements de la sagesse, de la clairvoyance dans les processus de prise de décision. Il s'agit là de la responsabilité pour les décideurs à tous les niveaux de faire en sorte que l'avenir des générations futures ne soit pas compromis ou hypothéqué par des décisions politiques frivoles qui ne tiennent pas compte des dimensions fondamentales du développement durable. Ces dimensions sont d'abord environnementales. On parle ainsi de la résilience appuyée par des politiques responsables et durables face aux pollutions, à la déforestation, à la dégradation des sols et à la perte de la biodiversité. Ensuite, économique, qui prône un développement respectueux de l'environnement, construit dans une économie verte. En d'autres termes, c'est l'opportunité pour nous de nous développer sans nuire à mère nature. Enfin, La dimension sociale qui interpelle la responsabilité des politiques et exige une gouvernance plus juste et plus équitable. Il faut comprendre que le développement tant souhaité devra, au prime abord, être défini, amorcé et poursuivi sous la seule direction des principes précédemment cités. Tout développement qui n'obéirait pas à ces exigences ne serait qu'anarchie. Donc, désormais, rien ne devra plus justifier toutes ces pressions que nous faisons subir à notre environnement. Il est important d'insister sur le fait que les États, ainsi que toutes les parties prenantes, soient tenus de considérer et de reconsidérer tous les enjeux que nos décisions politiques représentent pour les générations futures. Quel monde voulons-nous laisser à nos enfants, à nos grands-enfants et grands-enfants de nos grands-enfants et à ceux après eux? Ne vous faites pas de peine, car la réponse à cette question ne se veut pas théorique. Elle est plutôt l'expression d'actions conscientes et responsables dans notre vie de tous les jours. Encore faut-il rappeler que c'est à nous, décideurs politiques, qu'il appartient, brassant dans la quotidienneté de l'exercice du pouvoir, de définir en toute responsabilité le cap vers une planète résiliente et d'assurer un avenir durable et équitable. Le développement durable, au-delà des discours politiques, doit être traduit en actions concrètes afin de bâtir une société résiliente, comme pour dire que c'est à travers des politiques justes et respectueuses de la règle d'éthique et à travers des politiques innovantes et osées que les États pourront relever les défis du XXIe siècle. En ce qui concerne la Guinée, la voie vers le développement durable est tracée dorénavant dans la mise à profit de sa culture, car même si nous nous sommes fixés des objectifs communs, nous sommes convaincus que dans la recherche et la mise en œuvre des initiatives de développement, il ne s'agit pas de copier et coller littéralement, mais plutôt de définir notre politique dans le même sens que les objectifs pour le développement durable et la traduire dans le contexte guinéen. C'est en cela que nous donnerons un sens à notre combat de lutte contre les changements climatiques. La prise en compte de nos cultures et de nos valeurs pluriséculaires nous permettra de poser également des actions de développement efficaces et durables. Pour terminer, permettez-moi de rappeler à l'assistance la définition du vocable de résilience. Selon le dictionnaire de Robert, le mot résilience est du genre féminin, considéré en sciences physiques comme une valeur caractérisant la résistance du choc d'un métal. En psychologie, être résilient, c'est être capable de surmonter les chocs traumatiques. Quant à nous, écologistes, nous soutenons que la résilience, c'est la capacité d'une espèce à retrouver l'état d'équilibre après un événement exceptionnel. Alors, ensemble, oui, tous ensemble, main dans la main, dans une convergence conjuguée, faisons-nous l'obligeance de retrouver l'état d'équilibre de notre maison commune. Vive la coopération internationale et je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Seydou Bari Sidibe, for your address. And I apologize for the fact that we did not anticipate the need for simultaneous interpretation of your address. But on behalf of TERI, let me assure you that the transcript of your address will be available in both French and English in the proceeding of this workshop. I now invite Mr. Junaid Kamal Ahmed. He is currently the World Bank Country Director for India. Prior to this assignment, he was the Chief of Staff Office of the President of the World Bank. And prior to his work in the President's Office, Mr. Ahmed was the Senior Director for the Water Global Practice. So over to you, Mr. Junaid.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and namaskar to everyone. What a pleasure to be with you. Let me take a moment to explain where I'm coming from so you understand what I will say better. First, I'm a multilateralist. I worry about the world, about the planet. So everything I think about comes from the point of view of a multilateralist. At the same time, I'm the country director for India, so I worry about India's economic development. But given India's size and its impact on the world, I also worry that India's economic development and its impact on the world is something I need to worry about. Third is I'm a Bangladeshi. And as a Bangladeshi, I'm very proud in our 50th anniversary of our nation, we are close to becoming low middle income. And I worry that our path to growth today is subject to a lot of shocks from the climate change that is happening. So we are a country, Bangladesh is a country that's low middle income with all the characteristics of a small island development nation. So protecting the small island development nations and countries like Bangladesh is something in my blood. So those are the three perspectives I come to this discussion with, and they're not always consistent perspectives. I have to make them balance, if you will. So how do I balance them? I think I balance them by putting a request to the Honorable Minister of Egypt to think about COP27 with the following themes. First, I think we have to change the narrative of the COP from NDCs, asking countries to meet global achievements, to presenting the development transitions of nations. What is Maldives doing? What is Egypt doing? What is Guinea doing? Because today, the development transitions of the developing countries towards higher income is consistent with climate change, consistent with climate vulnerabilities, much more than the development path that industrialized nations took. And I think it's important that these development transitions be presented at COP so that the world can invest in the development transitions of the developing countries. There is no doubt that when India achieves its development transitions to higher middle income, it will help the world achieve its climate transition. This linkage between the development transitions of nations and the climate transition of the world has to be established at the COP. We need to move the debate away from NDCs and focus on the need to support the development transitions of nations like India, Bangladesh, Egypt, Maldives, and Guinea. And that's a different, if you will, narrative than the simple narrative of NDC. Second request is, if adaptation is going to be an important area of concern, then there are two topics that needs to be put on the table very strongly. One is social protection, and second is water. Social protection is the foundation which will help us brace for change that is yet to come. It will protect our poor, but it will also protect the human capital of our workers going forward. In India today, because of the pandemic, India has made a tectonic shift in the way it's giving social protection. India has the world's largest direct cash transfers to the bank accounts of women-headed households. 300 million women-headed households get direct cash transfers. India today has a program which guarantees in the rural area a job of 150 days per year. These are the type of social protections that will help communities brace for change. And I think the COP discussions must say, how do we invest in the social protection of nations? This is very important in the adaptation story. The second part of the adaptation story is water. India today, for example, has the world's largest water reservoir protection system. It is investing in protecting water. It is the biggest dams protection program in the world. It also has the biggest groundwater protection in the world, because after all, what is the biggest reservoir of water in the world? It's not the dams above ground, it's the dams underground, which is the groundwater. How do you protect the groundwater is essential in the world of resilience. This is another area that I think we need to really focus on. Egypt has an incredible sanitation program which needs to be put on the table, because that's the way we're going to protect communities today, because climate change affects sanitation, affects diseases, and the way we protect sanitation is very important. So resilience with social protection and water is the second theme that I would put on the table. The third theme I would put on the table is, no matter how much we agree on the amount of public finance that we will put on the table, ultimately leveraging capital markets is going to help nations propel their development transitions forward and hence propel their ability to deal with climate change. Let me give you a couple of examples, and I draw them from India because that's where I'm working right now. In India, 5 years ago, India barely had 500 megawatts of solar rooftop. And the World Bank, in partnership with the State Bank of India, introduced a program on solar rooftop, that's industrial solar rooftop, putting in $500 million. Today, 5 years later, the program has catalyzed the market and has grown by over 900%, where the 500 million in investment has drawn in $5 billion of capital markets into rooftop solar industrial programs. It has saved 17.7 million tons of CO2 over the lifetime of these programs. This ability to leverage market is extremely important. And referring to the point that the Honorable Minister from Egypt mentioned about the need to understand global experience, the program experience of India is being shared with Maldives, the African countries, Ukraine, and Turkey. It's the learning between the developing countries that's the future. So leveraging capital markets, using very carefully targeted public finance, I think becomes very important. I'll give you another example. $70 million of multilateral finance has leveraged 2.5 gigawatts of solar parks in India, which has leveraged $1.5 billion of commercial investments. Again, you use the public finance to draw in the capital markets. And I think this, how to do it and how to better position the world to do it, is something that the COP discussions must focus on in a very important way. Today, which no one would have believed, that the state of Madhya Pradesh provides 60% of the energy need of the underground metro of New Delhi. And that 60% is pure renewable from solar power, right? This is the type of change that I think we need to introduce. And I think the final point I'd like to make is introducing into the global dialogue how developing nations can leverage the multilateral institutions more. Today, in India and in Egypt, both countries are going to face single borrowers limit from drawing on multilateral finance, because you've reached a level of growth in which you've drawn from multilaterals that prevents you from borrowing more, because multilaterals begin to face single borrowers limit. There should not be any single borrowers limit if Egypt and India and Bangladesh and Maldives wish to take on 15, 20-year money to invest in their development transitions, which are green transitions in the world. How do you actually increase the ability of multilaterals to invest in nations, middle income and low income, will require a rethink of equity of the multilaterals, will need a rethink of how to use SDRs to actually provide guarantees for multilateral lending. This is an immediate instrument that is available. At the COP26, UK committed $1 billion guarantee for World Bank lending, additional lending to India for green financing. Just a simple $1 billion will translate into multiple of that amount today in the investment in green finance. So I think going forward, it is going to be extremely important that the COP dialogue change its narrative to investing in the development transition of nations, look at adaptations and resilience from the lens of social protection and water. Third, really look at how to leverage capital markets with the limited public finance that we have. And finally, I would like to say that what I hear from Maldives, what I hear from Egypt, what I hear from Guinea, is that the whole of government is behind the change in the development transition. This message must be central in the message at COP when development transitions are put in the world. That the developing world is not looking at climate change from a bunch of projects. It's looking at changing the nature of its development path. And that is a historic moment of change that I think Egypt's COP27 should use to tell the world. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you my perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Kamal Ahmed, for your very interesting perspectives, and in particular for drawing our attention to the potential of leveraging multilateral finance for accessing the capital markets, and also for your focus on social protection and in the process of transformation of national economies to sustainability. However, the challenge which was pointed out in the beginning by Her Excellency, the Environment Minister from Egypt, that for adaptation, public money is most essential, and there is only limited scope for accessing the private capital markets. That challenge certainly remains, and somehow or the other, the world will have to come to address, find means of addressing the resources that are needed for adaptation. Thank you very much indeed for your address. I now give the floor to Mr. Kamal Kishore. He has worked on disaster risk reduction and recovery issues for over 22 years at the local, national, regional, and global levels. Prior to joining the National Disaster Management Authority of India, he worked with the UNDP for nearly 13 years. So, Mr. Kamal Kishore, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. In the interest of time, I'll keep it really brief. We are getting close to the end line. But before, I have 3 principal points to make. But before I make those, I would like to say that I am so encouraged hearing from Honorable Ministers of Egypt and UAE. We had encouraging outcomes from Glasgow, and I am really excited to see how we take the agenda forward in Egypt and later in UAE. So that's very encouraging, very inspiring. So there are 3 things I want to say. The first thing I want to say is that, somehow in this resilience agenda within the context of climate change, there is a lot of focus on adaptation frameworks, NDCs, net zeros, a lot of climate jargon. If I were to make one request to Honorable Minister from Egypt, I would say, let's put people at the center. Our experience is that wherever our resilience building efforts have succeeded, they've not happened just because of government policies, international frameworks. They've happened because there has been a mass movement, there has been people's participation in this whole thing. If you look at Bangladesh, which has reduced mortality from cyclones by 99%, it's not because of government policies only. It is because thousands of people, it is thousands of volunteers, it is about the work that has been done at the community level. So how do you actually translate the notion of putting people at the center of this discussion? I suggest three things. Number one is that we really have to do a lot more local level analysis as to how climate is going to impact societies, communities at the local level. We are talking still too much at an aggregate level, at a macro level. So how do we put in place systems so that we have a better understanding of climate at the local level? The second is that a lot of the climate science right now is really far away from people. We really need to connect science to society. If you tell somebody who's living in the coastal areas of Odisha that they can expect wind speeds of 150 kilometers an hour, that's a very good scientific information, but it's totally useless. But if you tell them that it's 150 kilometers per hour, this means that all the coconut palms will get uprooted. This means that houses of a certain kind will have a certain level of damage. Then it becomes more accessible. I think we have to do a lot more in connecting science to society. The other point of putting people at the center is we have to do a lot of work, tedious work of organizing data at the local level and get the granularity we need to have. My second point is that There's a lot of discussion in terms of NDCs. We have adaptation frameworks, but I think we need to have much greater, ambitious, catchy almost resilience outcomes that people can relate to. Can we commit in Egypt or in UAE that by a certain year, all the coastal areas of the world that are exposed to strong winds will have a certain level of resilience that, whatever cyclone comes, mortality will be close to zero. Whatever happens in terms of strong wind activities, the power infrastructure will be resilient enough to be able to withstand that. We really need to have ambitious resilience outcome targets. And my final point is, this is more sort of inward looking for governments in the developing countries. While we are making a kind of case for international finance, grant-based mechanisms, capital markets to invest into resilience building efforts, we also need to exercise much greater imagination in aligning the ongoing development program in a manner that the collective impact is higher than their individual impacts. So how these things come together at the household level so that the collective impact of these programs is higher and it leads to building resilience. Countries like India are investing a huge amount of resources in building infrastructure. This is an opportunity to get it right. We have an initiative on Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure working with the others. It's an opportunity. There are resources already allocated for building infrastructure. We have to use that opportunity to get it right, for not just for now, but for decades to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Mr. Kamal Kishore for your insights into the whole question of how to ensure climate resilience, and in particular for your suggestions for the process at COP27. So we have now completed our allotted time for this very important ministerial session, and so I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers, our three ministers from Egypt, the Maldives, and the UAE, respectively, as well as the three representatives from Guinea, the World Bank, and the National Disaster Management Authority of India. Thank you very much, all of you, for your excellent presentations and the deep insights that you have provided in the course of your addresses. And I'm sure that this session has greatly enriched the content and proceedings of the WSDS 2022. Thank you very much indeed. And I would now hand the floor back to Nivedita.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful discussion. Stay tuned for more plenary and thematic track sessions, the agenda for which is available on our platform. Thank you.